Bitcoin was almost inevitable because people knew that the digitization of society would lead to a government overreach and surveillance and control. Satoshi stood on the shoulders of giants who were questing for digital cash, right? E-cash that we could use on the internet without government control. But really, I think what they figured out is what was more important was replacing central banking. Putin's afraid of Bitcoin. Putin's opponents use Bitcoin. If Putin had a plan for Bitcoin, we would have seen it by now. The CCP banned Bitcoin last year. It's very clear what dictators think about Bitcoin. They don't like it very much because they can't control it.
Bitcoin and this e-cash concept, in your mind, is the same thing as free speech and human rights. It's all kind of wrapped up in one because it's all about control and freedom.
One of the reasons I'm bullish about Bitcoin for America is that Bitcoin is free speech, private property, and open commerce, open capital markets. That's what Bitcoin is. Invest your time in Bitcoin. Learn about it. You can't lose anything by learning about Bitcoin. There's nothing to be lost. There's everything to be gained. And I'm pretty sure that in 10 years, if you're listening to this, you're going to look back and smile about the possibilities that you had back then. And we're going to be filled with one thing: regret that we didn't do more. We didn't educate more people about Bitcoin. We didn't buy more Bitcoin. Whatever. But we have time now when very few people believe in this thing. I mean, it's almost engineered in a way to generate disbelief. Every time it goes up, it comes down. And now, Bitcoin's dead. Bitcoin's not dead. Bitcoin's just getting started.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Alex Gladstein, the human rights advocate, lecturer, author, and Bitcoin evangelist. You have served as the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation for the last 15 years. Much of your work focuses on connecting dissidents and civil society groups with business leaders, technologists, journalists, and policymakers in an effort to promote free and open societies. As an educator, you've spoken at universities including MIT and Stanford, while also advising the European Parliament and the U.S. State Department. Your views on human rights and technology have appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. In your latest book, Check Your Financial Privilege, you argue that anyone born into a reserve currency like the euro, yen, or pound has financial privilege, and you describe Bitcoin as a Trojan horse for freedom, which offers the opportunity of a lifetime for human rights activists. Alex, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for the generous intro.
You're welcome. It's great to have you here. I would love to jump right into financial privilege because I think it's something that you articulate very specifically that I haven't heard from anyone else. And it actually quickly reminded me of a couple video clips I saw coming from Omaha, Nebraska at the latest Berkshire Hathaway meeting, where we saw, Charlie Munger, I think he said, quote, "In my life, I try to avoid things that are stupid, evil, and make me look bad in comparison to someone else. Bitcoin does all three." And then, of course, Buffett chimed in and said, "If you told me you owned all the Bitcoin in the world and you offered it me for $25, I wouldn't take it." And, I've been involved in the blockchain space for a few years, and sometimes it's hard for me to watch these kind of financial professionals just not even engage with this new protocol. And I'm just curious, how do you view those statements, and how do you view it through a lens of financial privilege?
Just disconnected from reality. The reality is something that is obscured from most Americans and Europeans, Japanese, folks in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, people who have a strong currency at home, which might inflate, but not usually until about a year ago, not usually in a noticeable way in modern times in the last 3-4 decades. you're kind of insulated from the abuse of monetary policy, and you are privileged by the kind of like this deep global architecture of the world, which is still built in kind of a colonial way. If you think about the way the global economy works, you have developed countries which import raw goods from the emerging markets and which manufacture, finish those goods, and then send them back, right? In many, many ways, the West still imports things like metals, oil, energy from like less developed countries, and they kind of accrue a lot of those benefits, and their currencies, in many ways, therefore, are much stronger, because currencies like the dollar end up pricing the energy markets, and end up being the bedrock of the financial markets, and the dollar and euro and yen end up being the reserve currencies that central banks want and that banks want to work with. They accrue so many benefits that just aren't there for the rest of the world. Only about 1 billion people, a little more than 1 billion people, live in a country with a native reserve currency. So close to 7 billion don't have that, right? So about 87% of the world lives in a country that either is an authoritarian regime where you don't have property rights, no FDIC insurance, no one's gonna protect you in court. The courts are owned by the state, right? Or you live in a country with a weak currency. And I think that people like Buffett and Munger are just sort of shielded, either intentionally so, they're looking the other way, or they're just kind of blind to the fact that they have this just enormous privilege over most of the world, and that for the average person on this planet, you can't trust your fiat currency. You can't really trust your bank. It's very difficult for you to like connect financially abroad if you have family. Things like capital restrictions, capital controls, frozen bank accounts. These are real. These are real things that people face on an everyday basis, and that the average person's daily life is actually one of having problems and difficulties with the financial system, where for people like Buffett, it's easy, whatever, they can like get a credit card or a line of credit, or they can borrow, or they can use Venmo or PayPal, or they live in the reserve currency of the world, the dollar. They don't have to worry about their nation defaulting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it just comes from being in a bubble, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was just talking to Jimmy Song recently about this, and he said, we kind of laud them, but they're kind of masters of this fiat system, and again, a reserve currency of fiat, and they managed to play this one game really well. But I guess if you zoom out, it's just a game, and when you look at it in comparison to the rest of the world, or a Bitcoin perspective or the rest, you're like, all right, they're really good at kind of gaming this system or maximizing this one piece. But is it really the value creation, and how does it really tap into the rest of the world? Is that the way you look, the way that certain people are kind of celebrated in like the dollar financial system or other ways?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I'd call it a game. I mean, it's the base reality of how the world functions. And I think it's something that Jack Dorsey said recently was very interesting in an interview he had with Michael Saylor. He was pointing out that he thought it was fundamentally unfair that people in Nigeria, a country of 200 million people, had to sit there and get the price of their money changed by arbitrary decisions of like a small group of old elite, white people in Washington at the Federal Reserve, board, right? Like these people aren't even elected by Americans, and they come from a very kind of similar background. They, you look at Powell, he comes from private equity, like that's who's deciding literally the price of money for the whole world. It's like the price of the dollar, the borrowing rate for the dollar determines literally every other price of money in the whole world. So I kind of look at it like in 100 years, I think we'll look back in time at this age where this literally tiny group of people control the price of money for the whole world. And we'll look at that as kind of medieval. I mean, it's crazy when you start to think about it that way.
And you mentioned like 100 years from now, if we kind of go back, not 100 years, but like I guess 80 some years, you kind of get to, I guess like 1944 and Bretton Woods and the petrodollar, and like you've talked earlier about creation of the UN and how like kind of our current reality was all formed around that kind of power struggle there. I was wondering, is that something you talk to people about to try to bring them into what our base reality is? And how do you talk to people that don't necessarily know the origins of where we are now?
Well, when I'm doing human rights advocacy, or I'm talking about, let's say, Bitcoin, you don't really need to know any of the backstory. You don't need to know any particular economic doctrine. You don't need to read a book of Austrian economics or anything like that. You don't need to know any history, actually, really at all. You just need to empathize with somebody whose money doesn't really work well. And it should be pretty easy for you to make the conclusion that, wait a second, we have this new monetary protocol where I can just reach them in minutes or in seconds using the Lightning Network. And they might be in the West Bank or in Havana or in Tehran or wherever. And we can just connect. We can be human and connect with each other. And there's no one that can stop us, no government or corporation. And I think, to me, that just should be a pretty obvious and immediate and incredible realization for folks. And not only do you have that direct human connection, but with Bitcoin specifically, you have the trust in the system and the rules of the money. We just saw a cryptocurrency hyperinflate yesterday. Terra Luna, right? This token, went from having a couple billion units to having many, many trillions, right? So that's not going to happen in Bitcoin, right? So you have kind of this promise of cryptocurrency, of this digital currency that can operate outside the control of the state and of corporations, married with an inability for small groups of people to manipulate and mess with the money rules. That's the magic, because it puts us all on the same footing. It doesn't make everybody equal when it comes to, for example, like wealth or anything like that. I don't really think it changes that so much, but it gives monetary equality, equality of monetary opportunity. So the billionaire and the refugee are the same in the eyes of the protocol. And I think, these are things that you can understand, without needing to do all the history. But look, yeah, doing the history makes it a lot more obvious. I didn't know the history when I first started getting into Bitcoin, of money and where it came from and how did the dollar become so dominant like that. I just didn't know any of that history. But learning about that history and writing about it and researching it for the book certainly helped me clarify my passion for Bitcoin and why I'm kind of so excited about its potential for humanity. In the book, I kind of have two sections where I chart the history of the dollar. Of course, the world once ran kind of on the gold standard. And I guess what I mean by that is that nations used to save in gold and they would balance payments with each other in gold. And I have this very elegant mechanism, which makes a lot of sense, where if you're a country and you are very successful at making something, you start exporting a lot of it, your industry starts picking up, your currency is going to start to appreciate. And that's going to actually start to slow down your exports because the price of your labor will get less competitive, right? So it's like this natural balancing thing. Your currency will then weaken. So it prevents any one nation's currency from becoming too weak or too strong. If your currency becomes too weak, then your exports get really cheap, and then you can start building your capital account back up again. This is kind of a natural thing that was happening in the gold standard, and it's how nations would balance their payments with each other. When you have the dollar hegemony, you have this like hack that the US government figured out where they, basically since the 60s, and especially since 71, we've just gone deeper and deeper and deeper into debt without ever having to balance because everybody else needs dollars. We figured out a way to swap the dollar with gold. And it wasn't a market-based phenomenon. I mean, a lot of people are like, well, obviously the US was just like a powerful economy. No. This was like a political thing. Like we sat there at Bretton Woods, as you mentioned, in 44. Keynes wanted to do the Bancor, right? The Brits wanted to have an internationally managed money system for the world to rebuild after World War II. And the US government was like, no, we got all the gold. You guys are going to use dollars. And that's going to create enormous demand for dollars. We'll redeem them for gold at $35 per ounce. Trust us. But you got to use dollars. So the whole world went from like kind of just saving in this neutral, decentralized asset, gold, outside money that couldn't just be canceled or whatever. They went from saving in asset money to debt money. It's incredible transformation. And all of a sudden, everybody's post 44 increasingly around the world saving in dollars. Dollars and gold are very different. Dollars can be canceled. Dollars are liabilities. Dollars are inside money. Dollars can be frozen, as we've seen most recently with Russia and Afghanistan. So I think that you can't overestimate the impact this had on the world. And of course, a few decades later, we rug pulled everybody and said, just kidding, we're not going to redeem these little pieces of paper for gold anymore. No way. So the dollar started to devalue as a result of what Nixon said. If you actually look at it between 71 and 74, the dollar lost half its value against the mark, the German mark. That just gives you an idea of like how weak the dollar got. We had crazy inflation in the United States. Now, Nixon at the time and Kissinger, they had to figure out a way to like stop this collapse of the dollar. So they were like, how can we get other nations to start propping up our currency again? So they hired a guy off Wall Street, William Simon. He was a bond salesman because they needed to sell bonds. And they hired him and he became Treasury Secretary. And they were like, well, who's going to buy our bonds? Who's got a lot of money? The Arabs, the Saudis. They had just been the beneficiary of a big political transformation where energy and oil, the lifeblood of our world, was run and controlled by Western corporations for a long time, right? The Seven Sisters. Okay, well, after the 60s, there was decolonization and nationalization, and these Arab countries took control. So the OPEC nations now controlled the economic lifeblood of the world. They had 80% of all the world's oil. Okay, so we sent Simon over to Riyadh, to Jeddah. The Crown Prince came to Washington. This was all in the newspapers. This is no conspiracy. This was like very, very open. It somehow has been memory hold. But in 73 and 74, we basically created what's known as the petrodollar. And it was quite simple. The agreement was such. The Saudis would agree to price all energy sales in dollars only, meaning if you're Malawi, you can't print your own currency to buy oil. You have to go get dollars. So this is just like increasing global demand for dollars because everybody needs dollars to get the oil they need to run their country and to improve. So number one, they had to price energy in dollars. And number two, this was the more tricky part that was actually somewhat secret and was declassified later in the 90s. They had to buy with the petrodollars, the earnings that they received, in dollar payments from around the world in these bank accounts that they had, usually in Europe. They had to recycle them into U.S. debt. So they would take the dollars and convert them into treasuries. And this would prop up the U.S. government's debt financing and all this other stuff, right? So what you had was that was one half of the deal. And the other half of the deal was the Americans, we would sell them weapons and we would protect them. And we did protect them. We protected them in the Gulf War. We protected them in the Iraq War. Anytime there was a threat in the region against the Saudis, we've come and we've saved them. And that was our end of the deal. And they've until recently, this deal has held up, and it's really been the defining characteristic of the last 50 years of the global political economy has been the petrodollar system. Now it's coming under, it's starting to crack now. But I think it's worth noting that a lot of people call this the petrodollar eurodollar system, which is actually, I think, pretty accurate. And it's just worth noting briefly that because of the petrodollar mechanism, there was this enormous inflow of money into these like European dollar denominated accounts, eurodollars, basically. A eurodollar is a dollar that's outside of the Federal Reserve's power. It's outside of the US banking system. It's a dollar contract somewhere else. Today now, there's more eurodollars than dollars, that there's just this huge floating market. But it wasn't always like that. It was a creation of the Cold War where like Soviet, countries wanted to, or Eastern Bloc countries wanted to do business in dollars. They didn't want it frozen by the US government. So they would open a dollar account in France or London or something like that. But basically the petrodollar system, gave steroids to the eurodollar system. And as a result, you had two things happen. The dollar, which was floundering seriously in the early 70s, became the bedrock and the numeraire for energy and for finance. That's the petrodollar, eurodollar system. So this allowed the US government to do a lot of things over the last few decades. We were able to do things no normal country could do, like fight forever wars, export our manufacturing abroad, basically come to a political arrangement where the only thing we really exported was in some ways was dollars. Like we're exporting dollars to the world, and we get all kinds of stuff in return. And through this system, we had to have a buyer for our debt in this system. And again, it started really with the Arabs and the West Germans. In the 80s, we forced the Japanese to buy a lot of our debt through the Louvre Accord, the Plaza Accord. And then in 2001, Clinton's last hurrah was getting China into the World Trade Organization. Okay, so all of a sudden we had a new buyer. China could do a lot more business with us. They were selling a lot of stuff to America in that first 2000 to 2010, massive amounts of stuff, opening up their economy. And guess what they did with the dollars they earned? They bought treasuries. They bought $1 trillion of treasuries in that decade. So you had this constant pressure over the decades as a result of the system, a buying pressure for U.S. debt. And again, this allowed the U.S. government to go. We're now in $30 trillion in debt. And it's because we have this external foreign demand for our debt, regardless of our economic performance, regardless of the fact that we're so indebted. This is highly unusual and will be seen as an aberration in history. So today the system is coming under pressure. Okay. Number one, you have foreign governments buying more gold than treasuries. You have China and Japan, the two largest holders of treasuries. They stopped their rate of buying, and they've essentially been dishoarding. They've been reducing their total stock of treasuries in favor of other things. You have countries starting to talk about pricing energy in other currencies, whether it be the Saudis selling to China, that's their largest client. They sell 25% of their oil to China. Why would they use dollars? They're going to start selling that in RMB. You've got Israel, an ally of the US, selling off dollar reserves to buy Chinese reserves. So this whole petrodollar euro system is coming under pressure. And, to me, the thesis of my book in many ways is number one, just charting the rise of global Bitcoin adoption as told through stories of people, but also charting this history of money where we went from essentially the reserve currency of the world being gold to being US treasuries, essentially. And then I think it's going to be Bitcoin. It's going to be next. So that's my thesis.
Yeah, it's a massive, the way you describe it, you see it's just this massive power play, the dollar, that started off in the ruins of Europe. And, I'm in London here, and we know that all these countries destroyed each other. And then the US kind of walked in, made the rules, and then kept pushing that power play in all these various forms into where we are today. The funny thing is, Alex, is that I studied economics at MIT, Sloan School of Business. I went to Wall Street, and they never taught me this stuff. Most people in finance don't necessarily, right? They don't necessarily even know the history of the world they're in. And they don't know all the connotations of it. Well,
what's really interesting is that this whole, the petrodollar thing was just glaringly obvious. And of course is now being discussed at length by Credit Suisse analysts and all kinds of people, where everybody's now talking about, oh my God, what happens if energy gets priced in a different currency? Even a year ago, when I first came out with this research on the petrodollar, and certainly before that, it was considered conspiracy theory stuff like Ron Paul would do. And it's crazy because you go back to the 70s, again, this was a totally talked about thing. The petrodollar thing there's tons of JSTOR academic research on it. For whatever reason, it got memory hold in the 2000s. And in my book, I suggest, a provocative thesis that may be part of why it was memory hold. In the end of the 90s, there was a challenger to the dollar, is the euro, right? So you had all the nations of Europe coming together. You go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, people were legitimately concerned that the euro would take over the dollar, right? I'm sure you saw this from your perspective.
Yeah.
All the newspapers were, even if deep down fund managers didn't believe it or whatever, certainly it was discussed. It was out there and discussed. And when the euro came out, it was quite strong against the dollar. Everybody remembers this. And look, one of the things that started to happen was the petro euro was born. This idea of oil countries selling and denominating currency in euros. And this is very important. It's not just about the sale. If you think about it, there's so many things that happen in an oil transaction. There's not just the sale, it's the insurance you have to pay. Right, for your shipment. It's the derivatives on top. That for every barrel of oil, there's way more derivatives, in an order of magnitude more than the barrel itself. So, you're talking about all those things start to be priced in other currencies. That's an enormous network effect, pulling demand away from the dollar, right? So the US government saw this clearly. Saddam Hussein announced at 99 he would do this, right? And then he did it. And he was selling billions of dollars and billions of dollars worth of oil in euros to Germany, France, European countries in 2000 and 2001, 2002. I think he sold something like $25 billion worth of energy, over that time. And in euros. And I think his country was like, at the time, definitely a top 10, but maybe even a top 5 oil producer. Okay. So what's really interesting is if you just look at it from sort of first principles, the petro euro was a thing, and it could have easily started to spread, right? Other countries that produce oil in the region may started to look at this. Okay. And then after the invasion of Iraq, one of the first things that happened, and this is again in the mainstream media noted, is not like some conspiracy theory. In June of 2003, the new Iraqi government went back to selling oil in dollars again. So, I mean, that you can say that it's coincidence or whatever, but the reality is that Saddam was selling oil in euros, created the petro euro, just a rival to the petrodollar, and then he got taken out. And maybe you want to say it's coincidence, but you know what? Like, the Iraq war is so crazy. As someone who was in high school during 9/11 and who watched the whole Iraq war thing, really shaped my worldview. Like, there is no good explanation for the Iraq war, just none. Like, it clearly wasn't for democracy. No one could possibly believe that. It wasn't to push back against Iran. Iran got a lot more powerful in the region afterwards, quite obviously, because we took out the Sunnis and the Shias now run the country. I mean, literally, like, Saddam was the one that we were funding to fight the Iranians in the 80s. So that doesn't make any sense. It definitely wasn't WMDs. That was all a lie. And this idea that it's for terrorism was also a joke. There was no connection at all. In fact, the invasion of Iraq later created ISIS in Iraq. Like, so
all a power play.
None of the official explanations make any sense. So there's still this like search for why did we invade? No one really knows. I mean, we speak of it in vague terms, and it wasn't about oil per se. Like, America didn't get very much by that point. Like, the US got most of its oil from its own oil fields, from Canada, from Mexico, from Venezuela. Like, it got a very tiny percentage of its oil from the Middle East. I mean, Europe was more reliant, but we just weren't that connected. But if you start to think about the architecture of the petrodollar system, well, we had to protect the Saudis. That was part of the deal. And I very much think that it makes as much sense as anything else, that we wanted to protect the system that made possible our geopolitical power projection. What made possible our geopolitical power projection was the fact that energy was priced in dollars, and therefore finance was priced in dollars. And that's going to start to crumble. And we won't be able to do the same power projection. And in a recent essay that I wrote after the book came out, I really explored this idea of quantitative easing and war and how they're connected. And it's so interesting because historically, at least in America, my country, but also it's pretty similar among most democracies, wars used to be fought with taxation and war bonds, or they would call them liberty bonds or whatever. So, when Keynes came out with his book, How to Pay for the War, like in World War II in Britain, I mean, it was about taxation. And you go back and you read Kant and Mill and Smith and all these people, and they said governments shouldn't borrow for war, but if they have to, they really need to tax for it. So you had this situation where, like, at least in America, like World War I, World War II, Korea, all these wars were paid for by taxation and borrowing. The American people during World War II, 85 million Americans bought Liberty bonds to the tune of what is now $3 trillion. Okay. So Americans, what I'm saying is that they were very involved in war making, even if they didn't go themselves. And they did go themselves. We had conscription, obviously. Everybody knew someone abroad. It was very different. And even if you didn't fight, you were paying for it and you knew it. Okay. So these wars the people were connected to the war. Like, it was a thing that we were connected to. But after the 60s, Johnson tried to raise taxes for the Iraq War. It ended up being one of the last things he did, and then he left office. I mean, he made him very unpopular. So since 68, there's never been a war tax in the United States, and we've never done any significant Liberty Bond sales again. And all of our wars since have been paid for on credit card, called the credit card wars. All the post 9/11 wars were paid by borrowing. And this is really only possible if your interest rates are low, right? So if your interest rates are high, you can't afford these wars. I'll give you an example. So we're seeing this now, right, in the last few months. But like when the interest rate was when the Fed overnight rate was like what 0.08%, which was a few months ago. Okay, so it meant that like bonds were 1% or 2% or whatever. For every 100 basis point increase in the interest rate, if you have $30 trillion in debt as a country, that's $300 billion more dollars that you have to pay this year to your bondholders, right? So you start talking about a 3% increase in rates. Okay, that's almost another $1 trillion. The federal budget for 2022 that Biden has projected is $6 trillion. And we only have 4.3 trillion of that covered by revenue through taxation, et cetera. So we already have an overhang of 1.7 trillion.
This will mean less 30 trillion. So this will mean less wars. The more expensive
my thesis essentially is that as we move away from the dollar hegemony, things like unnecessary forever wars in exotic places become it's not affordable. Like we're fighting this war called Operation Inherent Resolve that most Americans don't even know about, including me until recently. It's been active since 2014. It's a $10 billion war. And I mean, it's in 3 countries. It's in Libya, Syria, Iraq. Like most Americans have no clue about this war. This stuff is impossible. This is only possible using this like exaggerated version of fiat money as a base layer of the financial system. Wow. So as we head to a world of higher inflation, higher interest rates over time, I think it's going to be interesting the way it shapes the world. I think America becomes probably less aggressive. I think that we build more industry at home, and that there's more promise for the people. And, Bitcoin to me represents a lot of hope, because if you go back to the 30s, I mean, FDR took gold away from Americans, like literally Executive Order 6102, as I'm sure many of your guests have mentioned. I mean, look,
couldn't own it, right?
They made it illegal, and it wasn't legal again until the 70s. So when we had all this time of financial repression, like in World War II, for example, where they had yield curve controlled, and basically like any dollar asset was just getting crushed, because inflation was so much higher than interest rates. What was your option as an American? You couldn't go to gold, and gold was like obviously skyrocketed in value over those decades. In real terms, it ended up, if you look at it by the 70s, it was like, it definitely wasn't $35 an ounce, man. It was hundreds of dollars an ounce by the time that they really started lifting the restrictions on it. So
you look at Bitcoin.
A lot of gold people say it's still repressed today. A lot of people say the real price of gold is much higher, right? So today it's different. Today they can't do that anymore. Today, if we enter this period of financial pressure, guess what? Americans are going to have access to Bitcoin, and so will everyone else in the world, and that gives me a lot of hope.
So let's talk about Bitcoin. Do you think it's a coincidence that Bitcoin is now so prevalent, that it came about when it did, or was it born out of this financial need? Do you ever think about it and zoom out and think it could literally not be here, and then we wouldn't have this parallel world to observe this current world in? Or have you ever thought about that? And then your thoughts on Bitcoin also from a human rights perspective, and how it's like evolved with you.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have our world, and we live in this potential world. I mean, there might be parallel worlds. But I think that Bitcoin was almost inevitable, because if you look at the way it was designed, and I have a chapter in the book on its sort of prehistory and where it came from, people knew that the digitization of society would lead to a government overreach and surveillance and control. And this was predicted back in the 70s, 80s. There's books written in the 80s about the rise of the computer state. And at the time, there were 2, let's say, camps of how do we deal with this. Like, we know there's going to be overreach when stuff starts to get digital. Governments can basically do and execute their dreams much easier. Like, think about what Mao had. Mao would kill to have the technology that Xi Jinping has, today. Just think about that, right? In terms of surveillance, social engineering, DNA profiling, all that stuff. He didn't have that. He had to do it all with brute force. So if you think about it, what we kind of have here is two strategies. One is begging the government, basically lobbying, saying, please don't take our rights away. Give us our rights. So there's another camp of people who said that's not going to work. And that first strategy is still the popular one. Like, people are like, how do we prevent Facebook from violating our rights or whatever? Let's get the US government to regulate them. That's still the dominant worldview, is that we should get the government to fix the problem. The problem I have with that strategy, of course, is number one, most people live under an authoritarian regime. So you're not going to get the government to do anything. Like, if you live in China, this is not going to happen. So that's a privilege you have of living in a democracy. Maybe it's possible. Obviously, in the United States, we've seen that our government is not interested in respecting civil liberties of our citizens. Look at all the revelations of Snowden. Like, it's crazy. They were surveilling on us in a mass way, totally warrantless wiretapping, all that stuff, in collaboration with companies like all the telecoms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that please government, don't violate our rights thing, it didn't work out. So there were activists in the 70s and 80s and 90s called cypherpunks. And they came up with a different model of seize your rights with open source code, basically make it impossible for them to violate your rights and ask for forgiveness, not permission. And that's the Bitcoin way, because that's where Bitcoin came from. The first wave of cypherpunks focused on free speech on the internet, on privacy on the internet, and the kind of consumer level app that was launched off 2 decades of research was PGP in the early 90s by Phil Zimmerman. And he came under a lot of pressure. I mean, Senator Biden, President Clinton, Attorney General, everybody was going after him. They were saying encryption was for pedophiles and terrorists. Same thing people say, and criminals. Same thing people say about Bitcoin today. And they were saying we can't have privacy for Americans. We need a backdoor. We need a clipper chip. We need a way in. Well, you know what? They were defeated by cypherpunks, by businesses, by an alliance of people, and for the better. And it's crazy, the cultural shift today. You have people like Michael Hayden, who was chief spook during 9/11. He's saying encryption is a human right for all Americans. So we've gone this incredible cultural shift, and I would say encryption is more or less won. I mean, there's still threats, but it's been standardized in society. It seems unlikely that we go backwards from that. I know that the Brits were trying to have a third key into a peer-to-peer chat and things like that. And we'll always have that pressure, but Signal's pretty dominant now as an upgrade for mobile phones, on the PGP technology. And I think it's just becoming more part of our lives. But that was their first achievement, was making sure that you and I could communicate privately on the internet, which was huge. Second achievement in their holy grail was electronic cash. That's really what they wanted, and it was in culture. It was in science fiction in the 80s and 90s. Like, Neil Stephenson wrote amazing books about the future, and money actually played often a significant role in his storytelling. The type of monies that would exist, digicash, digibucks, whatever. Then it also was there in business. You had David Chaum, who was a researcher at Berkeley in the 80s. He came up with this idea of blind signatures for payments, and later turned it into a company called DigiCash, where you would swap your dollars or euros for basically this fully anonymous currency. Now, DigiCash failed because it was centralized. So a lot of these cypherpunks like Adam Back and Nick Szabo and others, and Nick Szabo actually worked at DigiCash. They kind of saw the promise of DigiCash, and then they saw why it failed, and they were like, okay, so the mint, the thing that creates the money, has to be decentralized. Okay, well, how's that going to work? So it was a tough problem, and it took decades, but eventually Hal Finney had a little bit of a breakthrough in 2004 with his reusable proof of work. And then 2008, we get Satoshi. And, as I write in my book, Adam Back gets this email, summer of 2008, this dude named Satoshi, or whoever named Satoshi. And they're like, hey, can you look over this thing I'm gonna publish? And Adam was like, sure, here's some feedback. And it's crazy. Adam had such a he was so built for this career, given his personal history and what he had been through. PhD in distributed systems, and he studied economics, and he came out with Hashcash and thought about this way of tying digital work to real world energy. I mean, he basically pioneered a lot of the stuff that went into Bitcoin. And, we talked about that in the book, but essentially like this was the big breakthrough, and we have it now. We have digital cash, but the cool part is we have something even better. We have digital gold too. And this relates to the human rights part, but I think Satoshi again realized that to make digital cash work, the mint had to be decentralized. So there could be restraints, or there needed to be restraints on monetary production. It couldn't be something that like the group of people could just change. I mean, then you'd be back to just the old way of doing things. Because don't forget, you can censor in two ways. You can censor by freezing or censoring, right? But you can also censor by demonetization or devaluation. You can make the currency worthless. So Bitcoin needed to protect against both of these things. So it's no coincidence that it was released during the great financial crisis, not during some surveillance scandal. And if you look at the Genesis block, obviously in Bitcoin, it references the bank bailouts in Britain, Chancellor on brink of second bailout of banks. So, people like me believe that Bitcoin was ultimately, look, it was Satoshi stood on the shoulders of giants who were questing for digital cash, right? E-cash that we could use on the internet without government control. But really, I think what they figured out is what was more important was replacing central banking. Okay, so people like me believe that Bitcoin is actually a competitor to central banks, and that it will ultimately be the reserve currency of the world. The cool part is it's not just going to be for governments. Everybody can own it. So it's this like ultimate check on government power. And that's what you observe today when you look around the world and see the tens of millions of people who use Bitcoin in Cuba, in Nigeria, in Argentina, in Iran, in China, wherever. They're able to have a little bit of freedom, regardless of how tyrannical their government is. They're able to take their work and time and energy and turn it into something that can't be stolen or confiscated or debased. And they're able to have the freedom to interact with that currency, their lifeblood, with anyone in the world. And it can't be stopped. And it's just, I think it's remarkable and much needed. And in some ways, again, inevitable, I guess, to close on the question you asked. It's kind of like the system created Bitcoin because the system was headed in such a repressive direction, and humans are, just very creative. And you see this often in dictatorships. Like dictatorships often lay the groundwork and environment for like very creative art, like amazing art and film come out of repressive conditions. So I think as the world was becoming more digital and repressive, something like Bitcoin was almost inevitable to happen. There's other theories about where it came from, but to me, the most likely one is that it was the work of human rights activists.
And Bitcoin and this e-cash concept, in your mind, is the same thing as free speech and human rights. It's all kind of wrapped up in one because it's all about control and freedom. And that's something that go ahead. I think
I'll just give you an example. Like Alexei Navalny is an opposition politician in Russia, right? So what's one of the ways that Putin has been going after Navalny? Well, not recently, he's poisoned him, he sent him to Siberia, whatever. Yeah. But over the years, like that organization was relentlessly attacked at the financial level. Their bank accounts were frozen, right? So if you freeze an activist group or an opposition politician or a newspaper's bank account, you basically disarm them, right? So that's like a tactic of government dictatorship, deplatforming, you could say, right? You deplatform them. Well, guess what? You can't deplatform Bitcoin. So, they were raising money in Bitcoin for years. They raised almost 700 Bitcoin over the last 6-7 years. And apparently Bitcoin and cryptocurrency account for 10 to 15% of their monthly income. So in terms of revenue, donation flow. So I think it's been a lifeline for them, and it's been a lifeline for many other groups around the world. And that will just increasingly become the case as more people learn about it.
Yeah, you mentioned how the typical response is to say the government fix our tech platforms and make sure that they're free. And that's probably the wrong way to go around it. In 2020, we got kind of deplatformed for broadcasting some things on YouTube, and it spun into then.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.